The day Mathis fired me, he did it in the shadow of my own creation. The scale model of the Solstice Tower sat between us on the ridiculously large mahogany desk he'd bought after we landed the contract. It was a perfect miniature, its crystalline spire catching the afternoon sun and scattering it across his smug, regretful face. He said all the right words: tough decisions, restructuring for the future, a different direction, corporate platitudes that meant nothing and everything. He said he was sorry. He wasn't. He said it was for the good of the firm. He meant it was for the good of his bank account. He was a symphony of insincere sorrow, and I was the audience of one. I'm Felicity. And if you've ever poured your soul into something only to have it stolen from you, then you know the kind of quiet, cold fire that started burning in my chest that day. Stick around and let me know in the comments if you've ever felt that kind of betrayal, because it helps to know I'm not just screaming into the void. This isn't just my story, it's the story of anyone who was ever told they weren't enough by someone they helped build from nothing. He slid a glossy folder across the desk. My severance package. A gag order wrapped in a few months' pay. He was trying to buy my silence, to purchase my complicity in my own erasure. He kept talking, his voice a low, soothing drone, designed to placate, to manage the situation. He probably read a book about it. How to Fire Your Partner Gracefully. He was explaining how he would be taking the lead on the Solstice project personally, how he had a new vision for its completion. He was using my name, my design, in the same breath that he was kicking me out of the house we built together, the house whose foundation I had personally poured, both literally and figuratively. The irony was so thick I could taste it, like rust and ozone. I just nodded, my hands clasped in my lap to keep them from shaking, not with fear but with a rage so pure it was almost peaceful. He mistook my silence for shock, for defeat. That was his first mistake. He thought he was closing a chapter. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly comprehend, was that he was just starting one, and in this new chapter, I was the one holding the pen. He thought the Solstice Tower was his monument. He had no idea I'd already turned it into his tomb. The walk from his office to my own felt like wading through deep water. Every face I passed, a mixture of pity and fear, they already knew. The corporate grapevine moves at the speed of light, especially when it comes to an execution. My office, the one with the slightly better view that I'd fought for, was already being sterilized. A cardboard box sat on my desk, the universal symbol of corporate death. Inside were the few personal items I'd allowed myself: a framed photo from our first year, when the firm was just me, Mathis, and a leaky ceiling, a collection of geological samples, a worn copy of a structural engineering textbook, trophies from a life that was no longer mine. He didn't even have the courage to let me pack my own things. A junior HR rep, a girl barely old enough to rent a car, stood there with a clipboard and a pained smile. She checked off items as another person. A silent man in a security polo placed them in the box. My favorite mug, a small ugly plant Lena had given me. It was a methodical, impersonal violation. They weren't just removing me from the office, they were excising me from the company's memory, one pathetic trinket at a time. The final insult was my laptop. The security guy unplugged it, coiled the cord with practiced efficiency, and handed it to the HR girl. She made a little check mark, property of Archer and Stone. No, it was Mathis and Vance. Or it had been. He'd insisted on changing the name last year. Vance was my name. He'd said Archer and Stone sounded stronger, more established. I see now it was just another step in scrubbing me away. When the box was full, they escorted me to the elevator, 2 silent guards for a prisoner who had no intention of fighting. The doors slid shut, and I watched their impassive faces disappear. Alone in the mirrored cage, I finally let myself breathe. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stared at my reflection. A woman in a gray suit, her face a pale mask. Who was she? For 15 years, she was the Vance of Mathis and Vance, the structural genius, the quiet partner who made the magic happen while Mathis shook the hands and smiled for the cameras. Now she was just Felicity, unemployed, erased. I pressed the button for the ground floor, and as the elevator descended, a single thought rose up to meet me, cold and clear as glass. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the real work. He thought he'd fired me. In reality, he just set me free. I drove not home, but to the site, the future home of the Solstice Tower. It was just a hole in the ground right now, a massive yawning pit where excavators crawled like mechanical insects. I parked across the street and just watched. The sun was setting, casting long skeletal shadows from the cranes that stood sentinel over the wound in the earth. That tower was supposed to be my masterpiece, my legacy. From the moment we won the bid, I had lived and breathed it. It wasn't just a building, it was a statement, a skyscraper that touched the clouds, but was gentle on the earth. The design was revolutionary, because of what was inside it, the very bones of the thing. I had developed a new type of concrete, a proprietary formula I called geolith. It was lighter, stronger, and radically more eco-friendly than anything on the market. It was made with recycled industrial byproducts and a biopolymer I'd synthesized myself after years of research. Geolith was the soul of the Solstice Tower. It was the reason we'd won the bid against giants, because I had offered the city not just a skyscraper, but a symbol of a greener future. It was my work, my innovation, and Mathis had just put his name on it and shown me the door. That night, alone in my apartment, the silence was deafening. The city glittered outside my window, a sprawling web of light and ambition. I could almost see the spot where my tower would one day stand, a dark void in the otherwise brilliant tapestry. The shock began to wear off, replaced by a deep, aching grief. It was a physical sensation, a crushing weight in my chest. It wasn't just the job. It wasn't just the tower. It was the 15 years, the shared dream, the partnership I had believed in, a professional marriage I had devoted my life to, and like so many wives, I had been traded in for a newer, shinier model. In this case, the model was pure, unadulterated profit. I found myself drifting through my apartment, a ghost in my own home. My fingers traced the spines of books on my shelves, texts on material science and tensile dynamics that I knew by heart. My gaze fell on my old drafting table in the corner, a relic from a pre-digital age that I could never bear to part with. This was my sanctuary, the place where ideas became reality. It was here, in the quiet hours after midnight, fueled by stale coffee and obsession, that I had perfected geolith. I remembered the breakthrough. It was 3 a.m, and the lab I'd built in my spare room smelled of curing polymers and ozone. I'd been working on a specific cross-linking agent for months, trying to increase the compressive strength without making the material brittle. I ran the final simulation, the numbers scrolling up the screen, and my heart hammered against my ribs. It worked. The stress-to-weight ratio was off the charts. It was stronger, lighter, and more flexible than anything we had. I called Mathis, waking him up, my voice hoarse with excitement. He'd been happy, of course, but it was a distant, detached happiness. The happiness of a man seeing a new gold mine, not an artist seeing a masterpiece. Even then, I should have known. The signs were all there, small cracks in the foundation of our partnership. I sank onto my sofa, the city lights blurring through a film of tears I refused to let fall. The flashbacks started then, unbidden, a cascade of memories, each one a small betrayal I had ignored, a red flag I had explained away. I saw us back in our first real office, the one we moved into after the garage. We were celebrating a small but significant win, a contract to redesign a pedestrian bridge. We drank cheap champagne out of coffee mugs, and Mathis had thrown his arm around me. "We did it, Felicity," he'd said. That word had been our mantra, our foundation, but when had we become I remembered the interview with the architectural magazine 2 years ago. The journalist had asked about the innovative use of reinforced polymers in our designs, a technique I had pioneered. Before I could answer, Mathis had jumped in, smoothly taking the credit, talking about my philosophy of integrated materials. He'd given me a quick, conspiratorial wink, as if to say, "I'll handle the press, you handle the genius." At the time, I'd let it go. I told myself it didn't matter who got the credit, as long as the work was good. I told myself he was the face of the company, and I was the engine, a necessary division of labor. I was a fool. I wasn't an engine. I was a ghostwriter. Then came the memory of Lena. I'd hired her straight out of university, a young engineer with a brilliant mind and a crippling case of imposter syndrome. I saw something of myself in her, a hunger to build things that mattered. I took her under my wing, mentored her, and brought her into the Geolith project. She was my sounding board, my second pair of hands. Her excitement was pure, untainted by ego. She revered the science. I remembered the day we finally perfected the formula. She'd looked at the final product, a small gray cylinder of the cured concrete, with a look of absolute awe. She turned to me, her eyes shining. "This is going to change everything, Felicity," she'd whispered. It was one of the proudest moments of my life. A week later, Mathis had called a meeting. He wanted to streamline the R&D team. He suggested moving Lena to a different department, something less critical. He said she was a distraction. I'd fought him on it, fiercely. I told him Lena was essential to the project's next phase, the sensor integration. He'd backed down, but with a look of annoyance, as if my loyalty to my protégé was a quaint, inconvenient sentiment. He didn't see her talent. He saw her as my ally, and he was already isolating me, preparing for the kill. I had won the battle, but ignored the fact that a war had been declared. The most painful memory was the one from 6 months ago. The solstice bid was in its final stages. The city council was wavering. Our competitors were giants, firms with decades of history and deep political connections. We had one thing they didn't: Geolith. But Mathis was getting nervous. He came to my office one night, looking haggard. He said maybe we should have a backup plan. He'd been talking to Centurion Concrete, a massive supplier, known for cutting corners and producing a cheap, barely-to-code product. He suggested we present Geolith as the primary material, but build in a contingency to switch to Centurion if the budget got tight. To increase our profit margin, he'd said. I was horrified. I told him that wasn't just unethical, it was insane. The entire structural design of the tower, its weight distribution, its wind load calculations, was based on the specific properties of Geolith. Switching to a heavier, weaker concrete wouldn't just be a downgrade, it would be catastrophically dangerous. It would compromise the integrity of the whole building. He'd waved it away, telling me I was being overly dramatic. An engineer's paranoia, he'd called it. "Don't worry, Felicity," he'd said, patting my shoulder in that condescending way of his. "It's just a thought. We'll stick to the plan." But I saw the look in his eyes. He wasn't just thinking about it, he was planning it. That was the night the seed of my own plan was planted. Not out of revenge, not then. It was planted out of fear. Fear for the people who would one day live and work in that tower. Fear of my name being attached to a disaster. I realized then that Mathis was a gambler, and he was willing to bet with other people's lives. He saw my genius not as something to be treasured, but as a chip to be played. So, I decided to build an insurance policy. It wasn't about revenge. It was about responsibility. It was about protecting my work from the man I was supposed to trust. The grief that had been crushing me began to recede, replaced by something colder, harder, a diamond-like clarity. All those years of loyalty, of telling myself we were a team, had been a lie I told myself. I had been his workhorse, his golden goose, and now that he had the golden egg, the solstice contract, he had no more use for the goose. He thought he had taken everything. My job, my tower, my legacy. But he'd overlooked one thing. He'd taken my design, but he didn't understand it. Not really. He saw a beautiful building. I saw a complex, interconnected system, and inside that system, I had hidden a heart, a secret, ticking heart. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling me from my reverie. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize, but I knew who it was from. The message was short, just a few words. "He's already talking to Centurion Concrete, the cheap stuff. I'm so sorry, Felicity." It was Lena, my shy, brilliant protégé. She was my proof. The last piece of my resolve clicked into place. The grief was gone. The hurt was gone. All that was left was a quiet, humming certainty. Mathis had made a fatal error. He thought he was building a monument to himself. He didn't know that I had already laid the foundation for his prison, and the first brick had just been laid. This was never about revenge. It was about consequences, and I was about to become his most catastrophic consequence. My plan wasn't born in a flash of anger the night I was fired. It had been growing quietly, in the dark, for months. It was a failsafe, a dead man's switch. I'd started building the day Mathis first mentioned Centurion Concrete. When a man you've known for 15 years looks you in the eye and suggests compromising the structural integrity of a 90-story skyscraper to make a few extra million, you don't argue with him. You start building a parachute, or in my case, a cage. The beauty of my plan was its simplicity, hidden inside a universe of complexity. The Solstice Tower's design was more than just steel and concrete. It was a digital entity. Every beam, every bolt, every pane of glass existed first as data in a building information modeling program, a massive, interconnected digital twin of the physical structure. Mathis saw the beam as a fancy sales tool, a way to create stunning virtual reality fly-throughs for clients. I saw it for what it was, the building's central nervous system, and I was the only one who knew how to speak its language. So I started to code. Late at night, in my home office, I began to weave a second blueprint into the schematics. It wasn't a separate file he could find and delete. It was a series of conditional rules, logic bombs buried deep within the existing code, disguised as mundane sensor calibration protocols. On the surface, they looked like standard stress test simulations, but underneath, they were waiting for a specific set of triggers. The first part of my plan was the concrete itself. My geolith formula was my intellectual property. I had the patents, filed under a holding company I'd created years ago for my freelance consulting work. Mathis knew I'd developed it, but he was an architect, a big-picture guy. He didn't care about the minutiae of chemical compounds and curing times. He just knew it was called geolith, and it was our winning ticket. He assumed the formula was company property. A reasonable assumption, but a wrong one. I had documented every stage of its development on my own time, on my own equipment. Legally, it was mine. He had the brand name, but I had the recipe, and I knew with absolute certainty that he would never be able to replicate it. He was too arrogant to try and too cheap to hire someone who could. He would just switch to an inferior product and hope no one noticed, and that's what I was counting on. The second part of the plan was the rebar, the steel skeleton that would hold the concrete together. In the official schematics, the ones presented to the client and the city, I specified a standard high-grade rebar, but in the detailed structural plans, loaded into the BM, the ones the contractors would actually use to build the thing, I specified something unique. It was a custom-forged steel alloy I'd been working on with a small specialized foundry in Germany. What made it special wasn't just its strength, it was its tensile signature. When put under stress, the alloy emitted a faint, but precisely measurable, electromagnetic frequency, a signature as unique as a fingerprint. I had the exclusive patent on that alloy, too. Mathis, in his rush to cut costs, would see the rebar order and just sign off on it, assuming it was standard. He wouldn't notice the obscure manufacturer or the slightly higher price, buried in a budget of $500 million. He would be, in effect, purchasing and installing the very sensors that would condemn him. The final piece was the brain. The tower was designed to be a smart building, fitted with thousands of sensors to monitor everything from temperature to seismic activity. My hidden code linked these sensors to the unique tensile signature of my rebar. The system was programmed to understand the relationship between the weight of my geolith concrete and the specific stress it would place on that rebar. It knew what healthies looked like, down to the microstrain, and it was programmed to know what unhealthies looked like too. If the sensors detected the rebar signature, but the corresponding stress load was higher than the geolith parameters, if for example a heavier, weaker substandard concrete was used, it would start a countdown. It wouldn't be a catastrophic failure. I'm an engineer, not a monster. The safety of the public was my primary concern, which is why I'd built this in the first place. The system wouldn't cause a collapse, it would do something far more elegant. Once the stress anomaly reached a critical predefined threshold, a point I calculated would be hit when the building was about 85% complete, it would trigger a cascade of fail-safes, heavy-duty magnetic locks on all stairwell and elevator doors on the 70th floor would engage. Industrial-grade steel fire shutters, the kind designed to contain a jet fuel fire, would slam down, sealing off every window and vent on the top 20 floors. The HVAC and water systems for the upper section would shut down. In the space of about 90 seconds, the top of the Solstice Tower would become a silent, impenetrable fortress. His monument would become a very public prison. And simultaneously, an anonymous encrypted data packet containing the sensor logs, the stress readings, the material discrepancies, and a copy of the original geolith specifications would be sent directly to the lead investigator at the city's Structural Integrity Commission, not to the front desk, to her private, secure inbox. I'd spent a week just finding that address. After I was fired, the first thing I did was call Lena, not from my phone, but from a burner I bought for cash at a corner store. We met at a noisy coffee shop miles from the city center. She was pale and shaken, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and loyalty. She kept apologizing, as if it were her fault. I told her there was nothing to be sorry for. I told her I needed her help. I didn't tell her the full extent of my plan. I couldn't put her at that kind of risk. I just told her I needed to keep an eye on the materials being used on the site, that I had a legal case to build against Mathis for breach of contract and intellectual property theft. It was the truth, just not the whole truth. Her loyalty to me, it turned out, was stronger than her fear of Mathis. She saw me as the person who had believed in her, who had nurtured her talent. She saw Mathis for what he was, a salesman who had stolen my work. She agreed. Her job in the Streamline department gave her access to the project's supply chain logistics. She was the one who processed the orders. It was perfect. She became my eyes and ears, a quiet, unassuming mole in the heart of his operation. Our communication was a masterclass in paranoia. We used a secure, encrypted messaging app on burner phones. We met in person only a handful of times, always in crowded, anonymous places. Lena would send me weekly reports, scans of invoices from Centurion Concrete, delivery manifests, photos of the material arriving on site, taken discreetly with her phone. Each message was another nail in Mathis's coffin. I organized the data meticulously, creating a timeline, cross-referencing every delivery with the construction schedule. I was no longer an architect. I was an intelligence analyst, building a case file that would be irrefutable. While Mathis was busy giving interviews to magazines, taking credit for my visionary design, I was in my apartment, watching his betrayal unfold in data points and spreadsheets. There was a strange sense of detachment to it all. I felt like a scientist observing an experiment. I had created the conditions, introduced the variables, and now I was just watching the inevitable, predictable reaction. I also spent that time shoring up my own future. I used my severance pay, the money he'd used to buy my silence, as seed capital. I officially activated my holding company, Vantage Point Engineering. a name I chose deliberately. I started making quiet phone calls, not to clients, not yet, to people I trusted, the head of the German foundry that made my rebar, a patent lawyer I'd known for years, a few grizzled, semi-retired engineers who valued integrity over a corner office. I was building an army in the shadows, a small, elite team of people who knew the difference between a good design and good marketing. One of my key allies was a man named David Chen. He was the head of acquisitions for the consortium of investors who had funded the Solstice Tower. I had met him several times during the bidding process. He was a numbers guy, sharp and unsentimental, but I'd sensed he was also a man who appreciated substance. He had asked me several pointed technical questions about geolith that Mathis had been unable to answer. I had stepped in, and for 20 minutes, David and I had gone deep into the science. He was impressed, I could tell. After that meeting, he'd sent me a brief, one-line email. "Impressive work, Miss Vance." I had a feeling David was the kind of man who didn't like being lied to. He had invested in a 90-story, eco-friendly marvel of engineering. I was going to make sure he knew he was getting a 90-story, cut-rate liability instead. But not yet. The timing had to be perfect. The building had to be almost complete. The lie had to be so big, so audacious, that when it was exposed, it would not just damage Mathis, but obliterate him. The public humiliation had to be as monumental as the tower itself. So I waited. I watched. I collected my data, and I built my new firm. It wasn't about revenge. I kept telling myself that. It was about creating a space where work like mine could exist without being stolen. It was about building something new on the ashes of the old. It was about proving that a foundation of lies, no matter how high you build on top of it, will always, always crumble. And I had designed the earthquake that would bring it all down. The first move wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It was an email, a single quiet email, sent from a secure, anonymous address I'd created for this sole purpose. The recipient was David Chen, the lead investor. The subject line was just 2 words: Solstice Inquiry. The body of the email was concise, professional, and utterly devastating. It stated that I was a concerned party with inside knowledge of the project. It alleged that material substitutions were being made that violated the terms of the investment contract, specifically regarding the environmental and structural specifications. It didn't mention Mathis by name. It didn't mention me by name. It simply suggested that an independent, unscheduled audit of the concrete and rebar, currently being used on floors 50 through 60, might be prudent. And it attached a single small file, a scan of a recent invoice from Centurion Concrete. I hit send and leaned back in my chair. My heart was beating a slow, steady rhythm. The war had been silent up until now. This was the first shot fired. I had no doubt David Chen was a man who read his own email, and I had no doubt that an invoice from a notorious low-bid concrete supplier for a project that was sold as a marvel of proprietary, eco-friendly materials would get his attention. 2 days later, Lena sent me a frantic message. Panic. All caps. They're here, auditors. Asking for material logs. My quiet email had landed with the force of a wrecking ball. Mathis, of course, went into overdrive. Lena described the scene to me. He was all charm and bluster, trying to schmooze the auditors, telling them it was just a routine quality check, a misunderstanding. He assured them that every material on site was up to his impeccable standards. He generated a flurry of paperwork, a snowstorm of lies designed to obscure the truth. He tried to bury them in noise. But David Chen was smart. He hadn't sent a run-of-the-mill accounting firm. He'd sent a team of forensic engineers, men who knew how to tell the difference between a real material certification and a forgery, men who carried little hammers and took core samples. Mathis could not charm his way out of a core sample. The preliminary report from the auditors must have been a bombshell, because a week later, the real panic began. According to Lena, Mathis was a ghost, stalking the halls of the firm, his face pale and his eyes wide with a new kind of fear. Not the fear of failure, but the fear of being caught. He was on the phone constantly, yelling at his lawyers, yelling at the Centurion Concrete sales rep. He was a man watching his gilded world crumble in slow motion. He tried to put a stop to the audit, citing project delays and contractual interference. He threatened to sue the investment consortium. It was the desperate thrashing of a drowning man. David Chen's response was simple. He froze the next round of funding. Suddenly, Mathis couldn't make payroll for the construction site. The cranes stopped moving. The work ground to a halt. The Solstice Tower, 70 floors high, stood incomplete, a silent monument to his hubris. The industry news sites started to whisper, "Trouble at the Solstice project, funding for Archer and Stone Tower halted amidst review." The noise was growing, and it was all pointed directly at him. He knew. He must have known it was me. There was no one else who knew enough to land a blow so precise. I imagined him in his office, staring at the miniature of my tower, finally understanding that the woman he'd discarded was the only one who truly understood what he'd bought. While he was panicking, I was working. My new firm, Vantage Point Engineering, was officially open for business. My office was small, clean, and filled with light. My team consisted of me, Lena, who had resigned from Archer and Stone the day the auditors arrived, citing a toxic work environment, and two of the grizzled, semi-retired engineers I'd recruited. We didn't have a mahogany desk or a view of the skyline. We had whiteboards covered in equations, powerful computers, and a shared, quiet focus. My second move was even quieter than the first. I drafted a simple one-page letter and sent it via courier to the CEOs of the 3 other major clients Archer and Stone had. These were clients whose projects I had personally overseen for years, clients who trusted me. The letter didn't badmouth Mathis or his firm. It simply announced the formation of Vantage Point Engineering. It stated my new firm's commitment to material integrity and structural transparency. And it ended with a simple, powerful line. "The door is open." It was a gamble. Non-compete clauses are tricky things, though my lawyer had assured me that Mathis firing me without cause had likely rendered mine unenforceable. A debatable legal point, but I was counting on something more powerful than the law reputation. These clients had worked with me for years. They knew who did the real work. They knew who answered the phone at 3 a.m. when a problem arose. Their loyalty was to me, not to the name on the door. The first call came less than 24 hours after the letters were delivered. It was from the COO of a major tech company, whose new campus I had designed. He was blunt. "Felicity," he said, "we heard there was some trouble over at your old shop. We're getting nervous. Our project is next in the pipeline. Can you guarantee us that our building won't be made of the same cheap junk you're hearing whispers about?" I told him I couldn't speak for Archer and Stone anymore, but I could speak for Vantage Point. And at Vantage Point, the materials specified in the blueprint are the materials that go into the ground. There was a pause. Then he said, "Send me a proposal." That was the turning point. The first crack in the dam. The next day, another client called. And the day after that, the third. They didn't just want proposals, they wanted out of their contracts with Mathis. They cited the news about the Solstice Tower, the work stoppage, the audit. They had cause. His failure was my opportunity. The final phase of the silent takeover was the public reveal. While Mathis was drowning in legal fees and hemorrhaging clients, I was finalizing a contract with my first new client, David Chen. He had not only pulled his funding from the Solstice project, but he had also severed all ties with Mathis's firm. He called me personally. He said, "Felicity, I invested in a genius architect and a revolutionary material. It seems I got the first part right, but the material never made it to the site. I have a new project, a research institute. I want it built right. I want it built by you, and I want to use geolith. The real stuff." We signed the contract. It was a fraction of the size of the Solstice deal, but it was 1,000 times more valuable. It was honest. It was mine. We didn't issue a splashy press release. We didn't need to. David Chen's consortium released a brief statement announcing their new partnership with a dynamic new firm, Vantage Point Engineering, founded by renowned structural architect Felicity Vance, for the construction of the new Kepler Research Institute. They made a special point of mentioning the project would feature the exclusive use of Vance's proprietary geolith concrete. The news hit the industry like a thunderclap. It explained everything. It explained the audit, the funding halt, the client exodus. It painted a picture not of a failing project, but of a deliberate, calculated betrayal. Mathis wasn't just incompetent. He was a fraud. And I wasn't a victim. I was his replacement. The narrative had flipped. He was the past, and I was the future. I didn't have to say a word. The story told itself. From my small, quiet office, I had dismantled his empire without ever raising my voice. He was surrounded by the noise of his own collapse, and all I could hear was the quiet hum of my work. The exodus was swift and brutal. It wasn't a trickle. It was a flood. The day after the press release about my new firm and the Kepler project, the 3 clients I had contacted officially terminated their contracts with Archer and Stone, citing breach of confidence and professional misconduct. They didn't even give Mathis a chance to counter-offer. Their lawyers sent sterile, legally airtight letters that were the corporate equivalent of a public execution. Within a week, nearly 70% of the firm's projected revenue for the next 5 years had vanished. The real blow, however, came from inside. The best engineers, the ones who had worked closely with me for years, saw the writing on the wall. They knew who had been holding the place together. They started quietly updating their resumes. My former assistant, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Maria, was the first to call. She said, "Felicity, it's a morgue over here. Mathis is locked in his office, and the rest of us are just waiting for the ship to sink. If you have a spot, even if it's just making coffee, I'm in." I told her to come over the next day. I hired her on the spot, Lena, Maria, and I became the founding core of the new firm. We were a skeleton crew, but we were loyal, and we were brilliant. Mathis finally broke. His desperation, which had been simmering for weeks, boiled over. My phone rang, and his name flashed on the screen. I almost didn't answer. I let it ring 3 times, then picked up and said nothing. I could hear his ragged breathing on the other end. "Felicity," he said, his voice a strained whisper. "We need to talk," I said. "There's nothing to talk about, Mathis." He started pleading. It was a pathetic, shocking sound from a man who had always been so composed, so in control. He said it was a misunderstanding. He said he'd been under a lot of pressure. He blamed the investors, the market, the city, everyone but himself. He said he had made a mistake. Then his tone shifted. The pleading turned to threats. He said I was in breach of my non-compete. He said he would sue me into oblivion. He would destroy my new firm before it even got off the ground. He was trying to scare me, to bully me back into submission. It was his default setting. But I wasn't the same woman he had fired. That woman was loyal to a fault, willing to swallow injustice for the sake of a shared dream. This woman had no dreams left to share with him. I let him finish his tirade. When he was done, panting into the phone, I spoke in a calm, level voice. "Mathis, if you sue me, it will trigger a legal process called discovery. Are you familiar with it? It means my lawyers will get access to all of your internal documents, every email, every invoice, every memo, and most importantly, the complete, unedited data logs from the sensors embedded in the Solstice Tower's rebar. A full record of the load-bearing stress on every floor. So please," I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, "sue me. I'd love to see that data presented in a court of law." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. I had him. He knew it. The very system I had designed to protect the building was now my shield. His bluff had been called, and he had nothing. Then came the final, desperate gambit. The offer. He said, "Okay, you win. Come back. Come back to the firm. We'll make you a full partner. 50-50, just like it was supposed to be. We'll call it Vance and Archer. I'll fire the marketing team. We'll do it your way. Just help me fix this. The Solstice Tower is dying, Felicity. We can save it together." It was almost comical. He was offering me the keys to a burning building. He was offering me the very thing he had stolen, now that it was worthless. He still didn't get it. He thought this was about a title, about a name on the door. He thought it was about revenge. "No, Mathis," I said, the calmness in my voice feeling like a physical force. "It was never about my name on the firm. It was about my name on the blueprints. And you chose to ignore what that meant. Goodbye." I hung up the phone before he could say another word. The power shift was complete. It wasn't just that he had lost, and I had won. It was that he had ceased to matter. He was a ghost from a past I had already moved on from. The real work, the work of building something new and honest, was just beginning. The climax didn't happen in a boardroom or a courtroom. It happened in silence. On a Tuesday morning, exactly as I had planned, the construction on the Solstice Tower had resumed, but only partially. Under pressure from the city, and with a skeleton crew of contractors, Mathis had managed to get work started again on the lower floors, a desperate attempt to show progress and stop the bleeding, but they continued to pour the cheap Centurion concrete. He was trapped. He couldn't afford to tear down what he'd already built, and he couldn't afford to buy the geolith from me, even if I had been willing to sell it. So he kept going, hoping he could somehow fix the problem later. He was betting yet again that he could outsmart physics. I was in my new office, a cup of coffee steaming on my desk. Lena sat across from me, her laptop open. On her screen was the live data feed from the tower's sensor network, a stream of numbers I knew better than my own heartbeat. For weeks, we had watched the stress values creep up, a slow, steady climb toward the red line I had programmed into the system. That morning, as they poured the concrete for the 75th floor, the numbers began to flicker at the edge of the critical threshold. "It's going to be today," Lena said, her voice barely a whisper. She wasn't scared. She was transfixed. "I know," I replied, my eyes fixed on the screen. I felt a profound, solemn calm. This wasn't a celebration. It was a finality. It was the last page of a chapter I was more than ready to close. At 10:47 a.m., the primary load sensor on the east-facing column of the 70th floor crossed the threshold. A single number flipped from amber to red. In the BM software, a hidden line of my code executed. A signal, no bigger than an email, shot through the building's internal network. We couldn't see it, of course, but I could picture it perfectly. A series of deep, resonant thuds echoing through the empty concrete shell of the tower. On the 70th floor, the magnetic locks on the heavy steel doors to every stairwell and elevator shaft engaged with a force of 2,000 pounds. Simultaneously, the industrial steel fire shutters, coiled like sleeping pythons in the ceilings, slammed down over every window, every vent, every opening from the 70th floor to the unfinished rooftop. One moment, it was a building. The next, the top 20 floors, were a seamless, windowless, impenetrable block of steel and concrete. A tomb in the sky, the second part of the code executed a nanosecond later. The encrypted data packet I had prepared months ago, the complete sensor logs, the material analysis, the chemical formula for geolith, and a timeline of the fraud was transmitted. It went directly to the secure server of the city's Structural Integrity Commission, flagged as an imminent public safety risk. The first public sign that something was wrong came about 30 minutes later. A news helicopter, likely dispatched because of a sudden communications blackout from the tower, began circling the building. From our office window, miles away, we could see the Solstice Tower, its top third now a flat gray monolith against the blue sky. It was stark, unnatural. A monument with its head cut off. Mathis must have been in a meeting, trying to salvage what was left of his company. I can only imagine the moment his phone lit up. The confusion, then the dawning horror as he looked out his own window and saw what had become of his grand monument. He had wanted to build the tallest, most impressive building in the city. Instead, he had created its most infamous, most spectacular failure. The headlines wrote themselves. Solstice Tower seals itself. A prison in the sky. Structural catastrophe, averted by mystery failsafe. He never called me again. He didn't need to. It was over. The city seized the site. The firm of Archer and Stone declared bankruptcy a week later. Mathis disappeared, swallowed by the disgrace he had so meticulously built for himself. I heard later he was buried in lawsuits, facing potential criminal charges for reckless endangerment. His noise had finally been silenced. A month later, I stood on a different patch of dirt, this one full of promise. It was the groundbreaking for the Kepler Research Institute. David Chen was there, along with the mayor and a crowd of reporters. My team, Lena, Maria, my two old guard engineers, stood beside me. When it was my turn to speak, I walked to the podium. I didn't talk about the Solstice Tower. I didn't talk about failure or betrayal. I talked about the future. I talked about building things that last, about the importance of honest materials and transparent design. I talked about foundations, both literal and metaphorical. After the ceremony, David Chen walked over to me, a small smile on his face. "That was quite a system you built into that tower. Felicity," he said quietly. "The city engineers are calling it the Vance Protocol. They've never seen anything like it. It's going to set a new standard for building safety." I just nodded. It was a necessary precaution. He looked at me, his eyes knowing. It wasn't about revenge, was it? I met his gaze, and for the first time, I felt the last lingering tension in my shoulders release. "No, David," I said. It was about integrity. My new office is nothing like the old one. There's no mahogany, no skyline view. It's a clean white space, filled with drafting tables and computers, and the smell of fresh coffee. On the wall, there is only one framed object. It's not a diploma or a magazine cover. It's a small gray cylinder of concrete, about the size of my fist. The first successful sample of geolith. It's a reminder not of what I lost, but of what I created, and what I was willing to do to protect it. My firm vantage point is thriving. We're not the biggest, and we're not the flashiest. We are known for being the best. We are known for being honest. Our clients come to us because they know that when we give them a blueprint, it is a promise. A promise that what we design on paper is what we will build in the world. Lena is now my lead engineer, her confidence as solid as the structures we build. Maria runs the entire operation with terrifying efficiency. My team is small, but it's a family, forged in loyalty and a shared belief in doing the work right. We are building the future, one honest brick at a time. Sometimes, late at night, I'll look out my apartment window at the city skyline. The Solstice Tower is still there, a dark silhouette against the lights. The top 20 floors remain sealed, a constant public reminder of what happens when ambition eclipses integrity. They talk about tearing it down, but it's a logistical nightmare. For now it just stands there, a monument to Mathis's failure. He wanted a legacy, and in a way, he got one. He will forever be the man who built his own prison. I used to feel a cold satisfaction when I looked at it, a sense of justice, of vindication, but now I feel mostly quiet. It's a scar on the skyline, and a scar on my past. But scars are proof of healing. They are proof that you survived something that was meant to destroy you. This whole journey, this whole fight, it was never really about revenge. I know it looks that way. I know the story of the secret plan, and the public downfall is a satisfying one. But at its core, it was about something much simpler. It was about ownership, not of a company or a building, but of my own work, my own name. It was about refusing to be erased. It was about drawing a line in the sand and saying my integrity is not for sale. My work has value, and I will not allow you to devalue it for your own gain. And that's the real lesson here. Your work, your ideas, your contributions, they have inherent worth. Don't ever let anyone convince you otherwise. Don't wait for someone else to validate you or give you permission to be brilliant. Sometimes, the systems we exist in are broken. Sometimes, the people we trust will betray us. You can let that destroy you. Or you can see it for what it is, an opportunity to build something new, something better, something that is truly your own. You have to be your own foundation. So if you're out there feeling undervalued, overlooked, or erased in your own life, I want you to hear this. Your value is not determined by your title or the approval of your boss. It's in your hands, in your mind, in the work you do when no one is watching. Protect it, fight for it, and if you have to, build your own table instead of waiting for a seat at theirs. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, if it made you feel seen, please do me a favor and hit that like button. It truly helps, and it lets me know that these stories matter. Leave a comment below and tell me about a time you had to fight for your own work. And if you want to hear more stories about turning betrayal into triumph, make sure you subscribe to the channel and share this video with someone who might need to hear it. It's a reminder that we are not alone, and that even in the darkest moments, we have the power to write our own ending.